For centuries, political thought was dominated by the divine right of kings. Monarchs ruled by the will of heaven, and subjects obeyed. Then came a philosopher who shattered that absolute authority and argued that individuals possess innate rights. His name was John Locke. His writings traveled across the Atlantic and found a devoted student in Thomas Jefferson, who ranked Locke alongside Bacon and Newton as the three greatest men who ever lived. You can see the direct result of that influence right here in the original text of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson lifted Locke's core philosophical triad, life, liberty, and estate, and adapted it into the famous guarantee of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The modern Western blueprint for individual rights, popular sovereignty, and democratic governance was built almost entirely from Locke's theoretical framework. Locke's worldview was forged in violence. Growing up during the brutal English Civil War, he watched the social order collapse into trauma and sectarian conflict. Seeking stability, he entered Oxford in 1652, but he quickly rejected the university's rigid, medieval scholasticism, gravitating instead toward the emerging empirical sciences, medicine, chemistry, and strict observation. Applying this empirical logic to human nature, Locke proposed the concept of the tabula rasa, or the blank slate. He argued that we are not born with innate divine knowledge or original sin. We learn solely through experience, meaning all human beings begin their lives as strict equals. From that absolute equality springs his political theory. By nature, every human being is entitled to life, liberty, and property, and any legitimate government can only operate with the consent of the people it governs. Locke established the theoretical defense of human freedom. Yet, the man who wrote it spent a significant portion of his professional life drafting laws that legally classified other human beings as disposable property. In 1667, Locke moved to London to serve as the personal physician and advisor to Lord Ashley, a powerful politician who would soon become the Earl of Shaftesbury. This position pulled Locke out of academic isolation and dropped him directly into the machinery of the British Empire. Lord Ashley was a Lord Proprietor of Carolina, and he appointed Locke to help manage the newly acquired North American territory. Locke and his patron immediately set to work designing a legal and social architecture for the colony, resulting in the fundamental constitutions of Carolina in 1669. Buried deep in the document is Article 110, decreeing that every freeman of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves. In the original handwritten draft, Locke personally inserted the word power, a deliberate legal adjustment guaranteeing slaveholders the right of life and death over the enslaved. Locke was an active participant in these realities. He drafted the specific legislation that codified judicial impunity for the master class. In London, the intellectual world was inseparable from the brutal economics of human trafficking. King Charles II threw the crown's weight behind the Royal African Company, a massive corporate enterprise designed to industrialize the transport of enslaved Africans. Locke invested his own money into the Royal African Company, as well as a separate slave trading venture called the Bahamas Adventurers. In the ledgers of these companies, human beings were logged as black diamonds. They were reduced to units of economic utility, shipped across the Atlantic to generate wealth for the empire. Locke even received shares of Royal African Company stock as direct compensation for his administrative work for the colonial government. Some scholars attempt to separate the philosopher from the atrocities by arguing he was merely a low-level secretary, dutifully taking dictation for his aristocratic superiors. The historical record shows otherwise. Locke later held a highly influential position on King William's Board of Trade. He was the leading commissioner, utilizing his expert granular knowledge of plantation life to craft colonial trade policy. The philosopher who defined the natural right to property was simultaneously a political architect explicitly trading human beings as property. How does history reconcile the philosopher of liberty with the bureaucrat of mass enslavement? The troubling truth is that they don't need to be reconciled. There is no contradiction. Locke's philosophy was the exact mechanism used to rationalize his colonial actions. Take his famous labor theory of property. Locke argued that a man claims ownership of nature by mixing his labor with the land, cultivating it, farming it, and drawing out its resources. This specific definition allowed English settlers to expropriate vast tracts of indigenous lands by declaring them unimproved. And because the colonial master legally owned the enslaved African laborer, the enslaved person's work counted as the master's labor, securing the master's property rights. Locke's definition of liberty was never meant to be universal. It was highly engineered logic, constructed specifically to protect the rights of white, property-owning men. Ultimately, Locke's contradictions reflect a tension inherent in the founding of the United States. The legal framework of Western democracy and the brutal legal framework of chattel slavery did not evolve by accident. They were constructed side by side by the exact same architects. The blank slate of human equality was stained the moment it was conceived. The foundations of the modern free world did not emerge from a vacuum of pure thought. They grew out of an ideology that relied on the blood, the land, and the forced labor of millions to sustain it. To understand the origins and the ongoing fractures of modern liberty, we have to stop reading the blueprint in a vacuum and finally confront the crimson ink in which it was written. John Locke is widely recognized as the father of modern liberalism. He is the philosopher who gave us the concept of natural rights, arguing that every person is born with an inherent claim to life, liberty, and property. This document, the Declaration of Independence, relies heavily on his ideas. When Thomas Jefferson drafted these words, he borrowed directly from Locke's philosophy to assert that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. Yet, while drafting these theoretical blueprints for human freedom, Locke was actively working as an administrator for the British Empire's colonial expansion. To understand the origins of modern liberty, we have to look past the philosopher's portrait and audit the specific ledgers he kept in private. In his early years, Locke was a quiet Oxford academic and a physician. He lived a scholarly life, far removed from the mechanics of global politics and empire. That changed in 1668. Locke was tasked with treating Lord Shaftesbury, a powerful English politician suffering from a deadly liver abscess. Locke coordinated a high-stakes surgery, inserting a silver tube to drain the infection. The procedure worked. Shaftesbury survived and credited the young doctor with saving his life. In return, he brought Locke into his household and granted him access to the inner circle of British power. This medical success ended Locke's life as a detached academic and placed him at the center of the British Empire's colonial machinery. Look at this map of the Carolina colony. In 1668, Locke became secretary to the Lords Proprietors, managing this North American territory. His employers immediately crafted a constitution to govern these coastal regions, planning to establish plantation economies built on enslaved labor. The result was the 1669 Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina. In the surviving manuscripts, we can see Locke's own handwriting. He edited Article 110 to read that every freeman shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves. That specific phrasing was intentional. It barred enslaved people from seeking recourse and shielded slave masters from facing criminal charges for acts of violence against their laborers. The philosopher who defined the social contract wrote a legal framework that excluded an entire race from its protections. During the same years Locke was drafting the laws of Carolina, he began recording specific entries in his personal financial ledger. This map of the West African coast highlights the operational zone of the Royal African Company. As compensation for his administrative work, Locke received transferred shares in both this company and the Bahamas adventurers. This diagram of the slave ship Brooks shows the reality behind those dividends. The Royal African Company industrialized the slave trade, transporting captive Africans to British colonies under brutal, tightly packed conditions. Locke was an active, highly compensated shareholder, drawing profits directly from the commercialization of human bondage. This is the title page of the two treatises of government. Reading it alongside his ledgers presents a glaring paradox. How did Locke reconcile his defense of universal human rights with his professional actions? He built an intellectual loophole. Locke argued a defeated, unjust aggressor could be enslaved in exchange for their life. But this logic fails against physical evidence. Locke knew colonial chattel slavery was a hereditary commercial enterprise, not individual captives from a just war. He used abstract philosophy to intellectually sanitize the brutal empirical reality of the slave trade he helped administer. We are left with a dual legacy. The man who articulated the principles of modern human rights also served as a calculated administrator of industrialized slavery. Locke was not just a product of his time. His own philosophy was used to construct the intellectual defenses for the era's atrocities. Western democratic ideals did not arise in a vacuum. They were built deliberately alongside systems of absolute racial subjugation. To protect the principles of liberty today, we must audit the historical hypocrisies of the individuals who invented them. In February 1689, a solitary ship crossed the English Channel through a winter storm. Aboard was John Locke, an English physician returning from 5 years of political exile in Holland, having fled the volatile reign of the Stuart monarchy. Locke arrived with a collection of revised manuscripts. These writings would soon provide the intellectual foundation for the Enlightenment and the development of modern liberalism. His 2 treatises of government argued that all people are naturally free and equal. He claimed that political power is only legitimate when it is used for the collective good and based on the consent of the governed. In the same year, he published an essay concerning human understanding. Within its pages, Locke explored the mechanics of the mind and introduced the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. These texts established a baseline for human rights that persists in modern governance. Locke argued that rights are an inherent part of natural law and precede the existence of the state itself. Locke's personal life, however, contained a significant contradiction. While he defined the parameters of absolute liberty, he was also a financial investor in the transatlantic slave trade. Records show Locke was a shareholder in the Royal African Company. His administrative career included serving as secretary to the Council of Trade and Plantations and the Lords Proprietors of Carolina, where he helped draft a constitution that enshrined the status of enslaved people. But the publication of these ideas changed their trajectory. Once a text enters the public sphere, its impact is no longer dictated by the personal actions or original intent of its author. Locke's philosophy crossed the Atlantic and became a primary resource for Thomas Jefferson during the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. History often suggests Jefferson simply swapped Locke's property for happiness as a stylistic choice. Jefferson pulled the pursuit of happiness directly from Book 2 of Locke's essay. This referred to the concept of eudaimonia, the rational effort to achieve a life of virtue and long-term flourishing. This paradox sits at the core of the American founding. The Declaration's central promise of natural liberty relies on the precise language of a man who facilitated the expansion of colonial slavery. By the mid-19th century, as the United States moved toward civil war, Locke's philosophy became a central point of contention. Pro-slavery intellectuals, including George Fitzhugh, Albert Taylor Bledsoe, and Robert Dabney, began to view Lockean principles as a direct threat to their social order. These thinkers realized that the social contract was incompatible with the logic of a slave society. If every individual possessed inherent natural rights, then the institution of slavery could have no legal or moral standing. George Fitzhugh explicitly attacked Locke's work as a mischievous heresy. He argued that the principle of human equality was an absurdity that had undermined the stability of the American government. Albert Taylor Bledsoe argued that individual natural liberty was a secondary concern. He claimed it must be subordinated to the public good, which he defined as the maintenance of the existing slave-based social hierarchy. The Southern elite recognized the tension of the era. They concluded that if the premise of natural rights was accepted as true, their entire civilization was illegitimate under the law of nature. Conversely, abolitionists recognized the potential of Locke's framework. They used his text to dismantle the legal arguments supporting bondage. The 2 treatises and the essay became primary tools in their ideological challenge to the South. Abolitionists applied Locke's logic of self-ownership to challenge the status of humans as property. They argued that because every individual has an exclusive right to the labor of their own body, the legal claim of a master was invalid. They also utilized Locke's requirement for express consent. Since no individual had consented to be enslaved, and the children of the enslaved had not participated in any just war, they argued that hereditary slavery was a violation of natural law. Abolitionists interpreted the pursuit of happiness as a binding demand for universal emancipation and the legal right to human flourishing. These activists utilized the architect's logic to challenge the very systems he once administered. They applied his philosophy to dismantle the legal and moral frameworks of the South. This required a specific intellectual maneuver. The abolitionists separated the logic of the text from the biography of the man. They disregarded Locke's personal involvement in colonial ventures. Instead, they relied on the internal consistency and the mathematical logic of his written philosophy. They used Locke's definitions of liberty to strike at the legal structures of slavery that he had once helped manage. This maneuver secured the logic of natural rights as a standalone legal tool. It allowed future movements to utilize the principle of self-ownership while acknowledging the moral failures of the man who defined it. Locke's legacy illustrates how ideas function in a democratic society. His work demonstrates that a specific principle, once articulated, can function independently of its creator's personal actions and outlive their limitations. The pursuit of happiness and the concept of natural liberty became a blank slate, allowing later generations to build a more inclusive understanding of rights. Marginalized groups claimed this logic for themselves. They expanded the scope of natural liberty to include a universal freedom that had been absent from the architect's own life and colonial policies.